The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the convoy as it moved through the narrow mountain pass in Afghanistan. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell gripped her medical bag tighter, her eyes scanning the rocky terrain ahead. As the lead medic for the joint military operation, she had seen her share of dangerous missions, but something felt different about today. The intelligence reports had been vague, and the local contacts seemed nervous during the morning briefing. Commander Jake Thompson sat in the lead vehicle, his weathered face focused on the radio chatter. At 32, he had led more SEAL operations than he could count, but his instincts were telling him to be extra cautious. The mission was supposed to be routine: escort a convoy of supplies to a forward operating base and return by nightfall. But in his 8 years of service, Jake had learned that routine missions in hostile territory were never truly routine. Sarah had joined the Army as a combat medic 3 years earlier, driven by a deep desire to help others in the most dangerous situations possible. Her small-town upbringing in Nebraska had taught her the value of hard work and helping neighbors, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of military operations in a war zone. Despite her petite frame, she had proven herself time and again, earning the respect of even the most hardened soldiers. The convoy consisted of 4 armored vehicles carrying essential medical supplies, ammunition and food for the troops stationed at the remote outpost. Jake's SEAL team was providing security, while Sarah's medical unit was there to handle any casualties that might occur during transport. The route had been cleared just hours before, but everyone knew that could change in an instant. As they approached a particularly narrow section of the pass, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. A small piece of metal glinting in the sun, barely visible among the rocks above. He had seen enough improvised explosive devices to recognize the telltale signs. His hand moved instinctively to his radio, but before he could speak, the world erupted in chaos. The first explosion rocked the convoy, sending the lead vehicle sideways into a rocky outcrop. Jake felt his body slam against the armored door as debris rained down around them. The ringing in his ears was deafening, but his training kicked in immediately. Through the smoke and confusion, he could hear the distinctive crack of rifle fire coming from multiple positions in the hills above. Sarah's vehicle had been third in line, and she felt the shockwave from the explosion ripple through the ground beneath them. Without hesitation, she grabbed her medical gear and prepared to exit the vehicle, knowing that wounded soldiers would need immediate attention. Her driver, Corporal Martinez, looked at her with concern as bullets began striking their armored hull. The ambush was well coordinated, with insurgents positioned in a horseshoe pattern around the narrow pass. Jake's team immediately began returning fire, but they were pinned down and outnumbered. The commander assessed their situation quickly. They needed to get to higher ground or find better cover, but the wounded from the first vehicle needed immediate medical attention. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Jake spotted Sarah as she sprinted across the open ground toward the damaged lead vehicle. Her Red Cross medical insignia made her an easy target, but she moved with purpose and determination that impressed even the seasoned SEAL commander. He provided covering fire as she reached the overturned vehicle, where 3 soldiers were trapped inside. Sarah worked with practiced efficiency, checking each soldier for injuries while bullets whined overhead. One man had a severe head wound, another had a broken leg, and the third appeared to be in shock but otherwise unharmed. She knew they needed to evacuate the wounded quickly, but moving them in the open would be suicide with the current level of enemy fire. Jake made a tactical decision that would change both their lives forever. He gathered 2 of his men and began a flanking maneuver to neutralize the machine gun nest that was keeping them pinned down. If they could eliminate that position, the convoy would have a chance to escape the kill zone. But the maneuver would require someone to provide covering fire from the damaged vehicle, someone who understood the tactical situation and could keep the wounded soldiers calm under pressure. As Jake prepared to move out, he caught Sarah's eye across the battlefield. In that moment, without words, they understood each other perfectly. She would stay with the wounded and provide what cover she could, while he attempted to break the ambush. Neither of them knew that this split-second decision would bind their fates together in ways they could never have imagined. The battle was far from over, and both Sarah and Jake knew that survival would require every ounce of skill, courage, and luck they possessed. The desert sun continued to beat down on them as they prepared for what would become the most important moments of their military careers, and ultimately, their lives. The machine gun fire intensified as Jake and his two teammates began their dangerous climb up the rocky slope. Every few seconds they had to dive for cover as bullets ricocheted off the stones around them. Sarah watched from her position near the overturned vehicle, her heart pounding as she realized just how exposed the SEAL commander had made himself to give them a chance at survival. The wounded soldier with the head injury was losing consciousness, and Sarah knew she had to act fast. She applied pressure to the wound while simultaneously trying to keep watch for enemy movement. The man with the broken leg was conscious but in severe pain, and she administered morphine from her medical kit while whispering words of encouragement. The third soldier, though shaken, was able to help her by keeping pressure on bandages and watching for threats. Jake's tactical experience told him that the machine gun position was manned by at least 3 insurgents, and they had chosen their location well. The rocky outcrop provided excellent cover and clear fields of fire over the entire pass. Taking out this position would require precision, timing, and no small amount of luck. He signaled to his teammates, Petty Officer Davis and Chief Martinez, indicating their plan of attack. As the SEAL team moved closer to the enemy position, Sarah noticed movement in her peripheral vision. 3 insurgents were attempting to flank their position from the east, moving from rock to rock with practiced stealth. She realized that if they reached the convoy, they would have clear shots at the wounded soldiers she was treating. Without hesitation, she picked up the rifle of one of the injured men and took aim. Sarah had qualified expert marksman in basic training, but shooting at paper targets was vastly different from engaging enemy combatants in a life-or-death situation. Her hands trembled slightly as she lined up her first shot, knowing that missing could mean death for everyone around her. She took a deep breath, remembering her instructor's words about breathing control and trigger squeeze. The first shot rang out, and Sarah watched as one of the flanking insurgents stumbled and fell. The other 2 immediately took cover, but now they knew their position had been compromised. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with something she had never experienced before: the grim satisfaction of protecting her patients and fellow soldiers in combat. Meanwhile, Jake and his team had reached a position within 30 meters of the machine gun nest. The insurgents were so focused on keeping the convoy pinned down that they had not noticed the SEAL team's approach. Jake could see 3 men operating the weapon, with additional ammunition and what appeared to be a radio operator. Taking out this position would require split-second coordination. Sarah continued to engage the flanking insurgents while providing medical care to the wounded. It was an impossible situation. She needed both hands for medical procedures, but the tactical situation demanded that she maintain defensive fire. The soldier with the shock had recovered enough to help, and she quickly showed him how to maintain pressure on the head wound while she dealt with the immediate threat. The sound of Jake's assault on the machine gun position was unmistakable. The controlled burst of American weapons followed by the sudden silence of the enemy gun. Sarah felt a moment of relief, but she knew the battle was far from over. Other enemy positions were still active, and she could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The mortar attack began with devastating precision. The insurgents had obviously pre-planned this ambush, registering targets and preparing for various scenarios. The first round landed just 20 meters from Sarah's position, showering her and the wounded soldiers with rocks and debris. She threw herself over the soldier with the head injury, using her own body as a shield. Jake's successful assault on the machine gun nest had given the convoy a brief respite, but the mortar attack changed everything. He could see Sarah's position from his elevated vantage point, and he watched in horror as the rounds began walking closer to the overturned vehicle. The medical evacuation helicopter they had called for was still 20 minutes away, and Sarah and the wounded soldiers would never survive a sustained mortar barrage. Without hesitation, Jake made a decision that went against all tactical doctrine. Instead of consolidating his position and waiting for backup, he began a solo assault down the slope toward another insurgent position. His goal was to draw fire away from Sarah and create enough confusion to disrupt the mortar team's targeting. It was essentially a suicide mission, but he could not watch the brave medic and wounded soldiers die while he remained in relative safety. Sarah saw Jake's lone figure charging down the hillside, firing his weapon and drawing attention from multiple enemy positions. She understood immediately what he was doing and why. The mortar rounds stopped falling near her position, as the insurgents shifted their focus to the attacking SEAL commander. But now Jake was completely exposed, running across open ground with minimal cover. The next mortar round landed directly between Jake and the insurgent position he was attacking. The explosion lifted him off his feet and threw him backward onto the rocky ground. Sarah watched in horror as the SEAL commander lay motionless, obviously severely wounded. The enemy fire was now concentrating on his position, and she knew that without immediate medical attention, he would die within minutes. Looking at the wounded soldiers around her, then at Jake's still form on the hillside, Sarah made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She grabbed her medical bag, told the least injured soldier to watch the others, and began running across the kill zone toward the fallen SEAL commander. Every instinct told her it was suicide, but she could not let the man who had saved them die alone on that rocky slope. Sarah's sprint across the open ground seemed to last forever, though it was probably less than 30 seconds. Bullets whistled past her head, and she could hear the angry shouts of insurgents who had spotted her movement. She ran in a zigzag pattern, using every piece of tactical movement training she had received, diving and rolling behind rocks when the fire became too intense. When she reached Jake, she could see immediately that his injuries were severe. The mortar blast had thrown him against a jagged rock outcrop, and he had multiple shrapnel wounds across his chest and arms. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and blood was seeping through his uniform in several places. But he was conscious, his eyes focused on her face with a mixture of surprise and concern. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jake managed to whisper through gritted teeth. "Get back to the convoy." That's an order. Even severely wounded, his instinct was to protect others. Sarah ignored his command and immediately began assessing his injuries, working with the swift efficiency that had made her one of the best combat medics in her unit. The most immediate concern was a piece of shrapnel that had penetrated his chest, dangerously close to his heart. Sarah knew that removing it could cause him to bleed out, but leaving it in place while moving him could drive it deeper into vital organs. She made the difficult decision to stabilize it in place and focus on stopping the bleeding from his other wounds. As she worked, enemy fire continued to pepper their position. Sarah used Jake's body armor and her own to create a small shelter, but they were still completely exposed from multiple angles. She could hear the insurgents coordinating their attack, moving closer to finish off the two Americans trapped in the open. The situation seemed hopeless, but Sarah refused to give up. Jake watched Sarah work with professional calm under impossible circumstances. Despite the chaos around them, her hands were steady as she applied pressure bandages and started an IV line. He had served with many medics over the years, but he had never seen anyone display such courage and skill under direct enemy fire. Even through his pain, he felt a deep respect for this small-town Nebraska woman who had risked everything to save his life. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors gave them both hope, but Sarah knew that the medical evacuation aircraft would never be able to land in the current tactical situation. The landing zone was still under enemy control, and the insurgents had shown they possessed weapons capable of bringing down aircraft. They needed to find a way to reach the evacuation point, which was nearly 200 meters away across open ground. Jake tried to stand, but his broken leg would not support his weight. Sarah realized that if they were going to reach safety, she would have to help him move. At 5 feet 4 inches and 125 pounds, she was less than half his size, but she had no choice. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as much as possible while staying low to avoid enemy fire. Their movement across the rocky terrain was agonizingly slow. Every few meters they had to stop and take cover as insurgent fire intensified. Sarah was carrying her medical bag, Jake's weapon, and supporting most of his weight. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she forced herself to keep moving. Behind them she could hear enemy fighters moving closer, hunting them among the rocks. Halfway to the landing zone, Jake collapsed. The blood loss and trauma had weakened him beyond his limits, and he could no longer help support his own weight. Sarah looked ahead to the helicopter, which was hovering just out of reach of enemy fire, and then back at the approaching insurgents. She made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of abandoning Jake or calling for help, Sarah managed to get him onto her back in a fireman's carry. At her size, carrying a 200-pound man in full combat gear should have been impossible, but adrenaline and determination gave her strength she never knew she possessed. She began moving toward the helicopter, one painful step at a time. The insurgents had spotted them and were closing in fast. Sarah could hear their voices getting closer, and she knew they had only minutes before being overrun. The helicopter crew could see their situation and were providing covering fire with door-mounted machine guns. But the enemy fighters were using the rocky terrain for cover and advancing steadily. Just 50 meters from the landing zone, Sarah's legs finally gave out. She and Jake tumbled to the ground behind a large boulder, both of them exhausted and Jake barely conscious from blood loss. The helicopter was so close she could see the crew chief waving at them, but the remaining distance might as well have been 50 miles. Enemy fire was now coming from multiple directions, and Sarah realized they were completely trapped. That was when Jake's teammates, who had been fighting their way down from the high ground, finally reached them. Petty Officer Davis and Chief Martinez had been battling insurgents for the past 20 minutes, but they had refused to abandon their commander. Seeing Sarah carrying Jake across the battlefield had inspired them to take incredible risks to reach their position. Working together, the four of them managed to reach the helicopter under intense enemy fire. Sarah continued to provide medical care to Jake even as they were lifted into the aircraft, her hands never stopping their work despite the chaos around them. As the helicopter climbed away from the ambush site, she finally allowed herself to believe they might all survive. Jake remained conscious just long enough to see Sarah's face as she worked over him in the helicopter. Through his pain and medication, he managed to mouth 2 words that would stay with her forever. "Thank you." Then the medical sedation took effect, and he slipped into unconsciousness, not knowing if he would ever wake up again. The helicopter race to the field hospital was the longest 20 minutes of Sarah's life. She worked frantically to keep Jake stable, monitoring his vital signs and adjusting his IV medications. The other wounded soldiers from the convoy were also aboard, and she had to divide her attention among multiple critical patients while the aircraft bounced and swayed through evasive maneuvers. Jake stared at his phone for 3 hours after Chief Martinez called him. He had read the article online at least a dozen times, studying every word and trying to work up the courage to contact Sarah. The article described her actions in modest terms, but Jake knew the reality of what she had done. She had saved his life at incredible risk to her own, and he had never properly thanked her. The first letter Jake wrote was 7 pages long, but when he read it back, it sounded too formal and military. The second attempt was too casual, and the third sounded desperate. Finally, he settled on a simple, honest message. He wrote about his recovery, his gratitude for her actions, and his hope that her transition to civilian life had been successful. He included his phone number and email address, but tried not to sound like he was expecting anything in return. Sarah was working a night shift at the hospital when her mother called with news that a letter had arrived, for her with a California postmark and a military return address. Her heart began racing even before her mother read Jake's name on the envelope. She asked her mother to open it and read it to her over the phone, and by the time her mother finished, Sarah was crying. The phone call that followed was awkward at first. Both of them struggled to find the right words, falling back on formal military courtesy even though they were now civilians. But gradually their conversation became more natural. They talked about their injuries, both physical and emotional, from their time in Afghanistan. They discussed their new careers and the challenges of adjusting to civilian life. What surprised both of them was how easily they could talk to each other. Despite having only shared those intense moments under fire, they seemed to understand each other in ways that were difficult to explain. Sarah found herself telling Jake things about her struggles with civilian life that she had never shared with anyone, including her boyfriend Mark. Jake opened up about his difficulties adjusting to retirement and his sense of lost purpose. Their phone calls became a regular occurrence, usually late in the evening when Sarah was finishing her shift at the hospital and Jake was winding down from his workday. They talked about everything from their favorite movies to their childhood memories, gradually building a friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences that few people could understand. The first time they met in person was 6 months after their initial phone call. Jake had a business trip to Denver, which was only a few hours' drive from Sarah's hometown in Nebraska. He suggested they meet for coffee, and Sarah agreed, though she felt nervous in a way she had not experienced since her first combat mission. The coffee shop meeting was both wonderful and terrifying for both of them. In person, they could see the changes that their shared experience had created. Jake walked with a slight limp from his leg injury, and Sarah noticed that he unconsciously favored his left side where the shrapnel had damaged his ribs. But more than the physical changes, they could see the emotional growth that had occurred. Sarah was struck by how different Jake seemed from the intense, focused SEAL commander she remembered. He was calmer, more reflective, and had developed a sense of humor that had been hidden during their military service. Jake was amazed by how confident and self-assured Sarah had become. The brave medic who had saved his life had grown into a strong, independent woman who clearly knew her own mind. Their conversation that day lasted 8 hours. They talked through lunch, dinner, and late into the evening, neither wanting to end their time together. When Jake finally had to leave for his flight back to California, they both knew that something important had changed between them. What had started as gratitude and friendship was becoming something deeper and more complex. The long-distance relationship that developed was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. They shared a bond forged in life-and-death circumstances that created an immediate level of trust and understanding. But they also had to navigate the normal challenges of getting to know each other as people rather than as fellow soldiers. Sarah's relationship with Mark became increasingly strained, as she found herself thinking more and more about Jake. Mark was a good man who deserved better than a girlfriend whose heart was clearly elsewhere. After several difficult conversations, Sarah made the painful but honest decision to end their relationship. Mark was hurt but not entirely surprised, having sensed her emotional distance for months. Jake's business trips to the Midwest became more frequent, and Sarah began taking vacation time to visit California. They explored the beaches near San Diego together, hiked in the mountains, and slowly built a relationship based on their present lives rather than their shared past. But that past was always there, a foundation of trust and respect that gave their relationship a depth that surprised their friends and families. The moment when they both acknowledged that they were in love came during one of Sarah's visits to California. They were walking on the beach at sunset, talking about their plans for the future when Jake suddenly stopped and took her hands. He told her that he had been in love with her since the day she had risked her life to save his, but that he was also in love with the woman she had become. Sarah's response was to kiss him with all the passion and emotion she had been holding back. Their family's reactions were mixed. Jake's sister Maria was thrilled, having suspected for months that her brother had found someone special. His parents were initially concerned about the long-distance relationship, but were won over by Sarah's warmth and obvious love for their son. Sarah's parents were more cautious, worried about their daughter getting involved with someone whose military background might lead to more danger and uncertainty. The proposal came during what appeared to be an ordinary phone call. Jake was in California dealing with a difficult client, and Sarah was at the hospital working another busy night shift. They were talking about their frustrations with their respective days when Jake suddenly said, "Marry me." Sarah thought she had misheard him and asked him to repeat himself. When he asked again, more formally this time, her answer was immediate and certain. The engagement period was a whirlwind of planning and preparation. They decided to have the wedding in Nebraska, close to Sarah's family and the small-town community that had shaped her values. Jake's military friends would travel from around the country, and Sarah's hospital colleagues were eager to meet the man who had captured their beloved colleague's heart. But as the wedding day approached, both Jake and Sarah found themselves thinking more and more about the other soldiers who had been with them during that ambush in Afghanistan. Some had been wounded that day, others had continued their military service, and a few had not made it home alive. Their wedding would be a celebration of love, but it would also be a tribute to the brotherhood and sacrifice that had brought them together. The field hospital erupted into controlled chaos as the medical evacuation helicopter touched down. Sarah had radioed ahead with the casualties' conditions, and the surgical team was already prepared for multiple trauma patients. As they wheeled Jake into the operating room, Sarah felt a strange emptiness, as if part of herself was being taken away. She had been responsible for keeping him alive for the past hour, and now she had to trust others to continue that fight. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the chief trauma surgeon, worked on Jake for over 6 hours. The shrapnel near his heart required delicate removal. His broken leg needed surgical repair with metal plates and screws, and he had lost significant blood from multiple wounds. Sarah found herself checking on his condition every few hours, telling herself it was professional concern, but knowing it was something deeper. Jake's recovery was slow and painful. When he finally regained consciousness 3 days later, the first person he asked about was the medic who had saved his life. The nurses told him that Lieutenant Mitchell had been reassigned to another forward operating base 2 days earlier, as part of a routine rotation. He felt a profound disappointment that surprised him with its intensity. Sarah's new assignment was at a base 200 kilometers away, where she continued her duties as a combat medic. But her mind often wandered back to those terrifying moments when she had carried the wounded SEAL commander to safety. She told herself it was natural to think about such an intense experience, but she knew her feelings ran deeper than professional satisfaction. During his rehabilitation, Jake learned more about Sarah's background. Her commanding officer, Colonel Williams, spoke highly of her skills and dedication. She had grown up on a small farm in Nebraska, the daughter of a veterinarian and a schoolteacher. She had joined the Army to serve her country and to get medical training that would allow her to help people in her hometown when her service ended. Jake's own background was quite different. He had grown up in California, the son of a Marine Corps officer and a nurse. Military service was a family tradition, and he had always known he would serve his country. His path to the SEALs had been driven by a desire to be part of the most elite fighting force in the world, to test himself against the ultimate challenges. The physical therapy for Jake's leg was grueling, but he approached it with the same determination that had made him a successful SEAL commander. His therapists were amazed by his progress, though they did not know that part of his motivation was the hope of somehow reconnecting with the medic who had risked her life for his. He carried a small piece of paper in his wallet with her unit information, though he could never quite bring himself to write the letter he composed in his mind dozens of times. Sarah's tour in Afghanistan was scheduled to end 3 months after the ambush. During those final weeks, she found herself hoping she might encounter Jake again, perhaps at the main base where soldiers sometimes passed through during transfers. But their paths never crossed, and she completed her deployment without seeing him again. The return to civilian life was difficult for both of them, though for different reasons. Jake's injuries forced him to retire from active duty earlier than he had planned. His leg would never be completely normal, and the military doctors determined he was no longer fit for SEAL operations. At 33, he faced the challenge of building a new life outside the military structure that had defined him for over a decade. Sarah completed her military service and returned to Nebraska, where she used her medical training to become a registered nurse. She found work at the regional hospital in her hometown, where she specialized in emergency medicine. The skills she had learned in combat served her well in the civilian emergency room, but she often found herself missing the intensity and clear purpose of military service. For 2 years, both Jake and Sarah tried to build new lives while carrying memories of those crucial moments they had shared. Jake used his military experience and leadership skills to start a security consulting business in San Diego. The work was successful, but he felt an emptiness that he could not quite identify. He dated occasionally, but no relationship seemed to capture his interest for long. Sarah threw herself into her work at the hospital and became involved in her community. She volunteered with the local volunteer fire department, using her medical skills to help with emergency calls. She also started dating a local teacher named Mark, a kind and stable man who represented everything her family thought she should want in a husband. But even as their relationship became more serious, she felt like something was missing. The nightmares were the worst part for both of them. Sarah would wake up in the middle of the night, hearing the sound of mortars and machine gun fire. Sometimes she dreamed that she had not been fast enough, that Jake had died on that rocky hillside while she watched helplessly. Jake's dreams were different but equally disturbing. He relived the moment when Sarah had appeared in the midst of the battle. Risking everything to reach him, Jake's sister, Maria, was the first person to suggest that he try to contact Sarah. During one of their regular phone conversations, Jake found himself telling her about the ambush and the medic who had saved his life. Maria listened carefully, then asked why he had never tried to reach out to thank her properly. The question haunted Jake for weeks. Sarah's mother noticed the change in her daughter during one of their regular dinners together. Sarah had always been focused and determined, but since returning from Afghanistan, she seemed restless and distracted. When her mother gently pressed for details, Sarah found herself telling the story of the ambush and the SEAL commander she had helped rescue. The catalyst that would bring them back together came from an unexpected source. A military journalist named David Rodriguez was writing a series of articles about heroic actions by combat medics in Afghanistan. He had heard about Sarah's rescue of the SEAL commander through military channels and contacted her for an interview. Initially reluctant, Sarah eventually agreed to tell her story, hoping it might help other veterans dealing with similar experiences. The article was published in a national military magazine and was picked up by several online veteran forums. Jake's former teammate, Chief Martinez, saw the article and immediately recognized the story. He called Jake that same day, reading portions of the article over the phone and providing Sarah's hometown information that was mentioned in the piece. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful in the Nebraska countryside. Sarah stood at her childhood bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the wheat fields golden, and thought about the journey that had brought her to this day. 3 years ago, she had been a combat medic in Afghanistan, focused solely on saving lives and completing her mission. Now she was about to marry the man whose life she had saved and who had, in return, saved her heart. Jake had arrived in town 3 days earlier with a convoy of his former SEAL teammates, men who had traveled from across the country to witness their commander's wedding. Chief Martinez had driven up from Texas, Petty Officer Davis had flown in from Virginia, and even some of the men who had been wounded in the ambush had made the trip. Their presence turned the small Nebraska town into an impromptu military reunion. The church where Sarah had been baptized and confirmed was decorated with white roses and blue hydrangeas, chosen to honor both her preference for simple elegance and his connection to the Navy. Her wedding dress was her grandmother's, altered to fit her smaller frame but retaining the classic lines and delicate lace that had made it beautiful 60 years earlier. Something borrowed, something blue, and something old all in one cherished garment. As Sarah's father walked her down the aisle, she could see Jake waiting at the altar in his dress uniform, complete with the medals he had earned during his years of service. His normally confident bearing seemed slightly nervous, and she could see him favoring his injured leg as he stood waiting for her. The scars they both carried from Afghanistan were invisible to most of the guests, but they were part of the story that had brought them together. The wedding guests were an unusual mix that reflected both their backgrounds. Sarah's side of the church was filled with her childhood friends, hospital colleagues, and extended family from the farming community. Jake's side included not only his military brothers but also his family from California, and the clients who had become friends through his security consulting business. Two worlds that had little in common except their love for the bride and groom. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the trauma surgeon who had operated on Jake in Afghanistan, had flown in from Germany where she was now stationed. She sat in the front row remembering the night she had worked to save his life while Sarah waited anxiously outside the operating room. Seeing them together now happy and whole gave her a satisfaction that went beyond professional pride. Colonel Williams, Sarah's former commanding officer, had the honor of giving a reading during the ceremony. He chose a passage about courage and sacrifice that seemed particularly appropriate for two people whose love story had begun in combat. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke about the privilege of serving with soldiers like Sarah, who embodied the best values of the military. The ceremony itself was traditional but deeply personal. Jake and Sarah had written their own vows, and when Jake spoke about the day Sarah had risked everything to save his life, there was not a dry eye in the church. Sarah's vows focused not on that dramatic moment, but on the quiet courage Jake had shown in building a new life after his military career ended, and her gratitude for his patient persistence in pursuing their relationship. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed by people from every phase of their lives. But for Jake and Sarah in that moment, they were back on that rocky hillside in Afghanistan, two people who had found each other in the chaos of war and chosen to build a life together in the peace that followed. The reception was held at Sarah's family farm, under a huge tent that her father and uncles had spent weeks preparing. The evening was filled with speeches that ranged from humorous military stories to heartfelt tributes from Sarah's patients and their families. Jake's best man, Chief Martinez, told the story of how Jake had talked about Sarah constantly during his recovery. Even though he claimed he was just expressing professional gratitude, Sarah's maid of honor was her nursing school roommate, who revealed that Sarah had never stopped thinking about the SEAL commander she had rescued, despite dating other men and trying to move on with her life. She described how Sarah would sometimes wake up from nightmares about the ambush, always with the same fear that she had not been fast enough to save him. The dancing began with Jake and Sarah's first dance to a song they had chosen together, a ballad about finding love in unexpected places. Jake's leg injury made dancing challenging, but Sarah adapted her steps to match his limitations, and their obvious love for each other made their performance beautiful despite its imperfections. Soon the dance floor was filled with military couples who understood the unique challenges of loving someone whose service had changed them in fundamental ways. As the evening progressed, the celebration became a tribute to all the men and women who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Stories were shared about friends who had not made it home. Toasts were raised to the wounded who continued to fight their battles in civilian life, and gratitude was expressed for the families who had supported them all through the difficult years of deployment and recovery. The highlight of the reception came when Jake surprised Sarah by arranging for a video message from the soldiers she had treated during the ambush. The men whose lives she had saved that day, now recovered and living their own civilian lives, spoke about how her courage and skill had given them the chance to see their families again. Their gratitude was profound and moving, reminding everyone present of the real impact of military service. Late in the evening, as the party began to wind down, Jake and Sarah found themselves alone for a few minutes on the farmhouse porch where she had played as a child. They could hear the laughter and conversation continuing in the tent, but they needed a moment to absorb the significance of what had happened. They were no longer two separate people carrying the weight of their shared experience, but a married couple ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. As they prepared to leave for their honeymoon, Sarah threw her bouquet to the crowd of single women. It was caught by a young Army nurse who had driven up from Fort Riley for the wedding, a woman whose own story of military service and the search for love was just beginning. Jake and Sarah drove away in a car decorated by his SEAL teammates, heading for a week in the Colorado mountains where they could finally be alone together as husband and wife. The last image their wedding guests had of them was the car disappearing down the country road. Two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances and built a future based on courage, sacrifice, and an unshakable commitment to each other. Their story had begun in the chaos of war, but it would continue in the quiet strength of a love that had been tested by fire and proven unbreakable.